Hi everyone, welcome back. I have another video for you. Feel like it's been forever since I did one of these. Of course, I always feel the need to apologize when it's been a while, but life happens, health issues and other things have been going on that have been preventing me from doing this, but here we are. So much to talk about, so little time, so much happening in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world. Obviously, everyone's glued to their TVs watching the World Cup these days, but we do need to pay attention to what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere. Let's just talk about some of the key issues that really I think need to be at the forefront of our thinking right now. Um, well, let's begin with the broadest question. What is going on with Ukraine's victories? We all have seen what's happening. What does this mean? What is the future of this conflict? What does it mean for Ukraine, for Russia, for the United States? Because as we all know, the United States is not simply an ally of Ukraine. United States is to a large degree an active participant here now, not active in the sense of sending troops, but in almost every other sense of the word. And so we have to think about this. So the question really that I lead in with that to ask the broader question: are Ukraine's victories becoming a problem for the United States? Now, it seems like kind of an absurd question because one would assume that being that the United States is backing Ukraine, Ukraine's victory should spell victory for the United States. But it's not that simple. And as we know, with everything related to Russia's war in Ukraine, everything has knock on effects. Everything has these ramifications that affect a lot of different issues. So let's discuss what this really means. So there's been a couple of pieces written about this. I'm going off of, I guess, probably a combination of two or three of those. One of them was in Bloomberg that I thought was excellent. New York Times had another piece on that. Basically, the question is what happens now? The Ukrainians achieved a massive victory with the liberation of Kherson. It's clear that when Russia annexed Kherson and Zaporizhia, it did so with the intention of, at the very least, fighting for those territories, occupying those territories, controlling them, even if it couldn't, directly and easily govern all of that territory, at least to be able to occupy it. But no, thanks to Ukrainian I don't know, ingenuity and heroism and backing from much larger states and other things, the Ukrainians have been able to dislodge the Russians, at least from the center of Kherson. It moved them to the other bank of the river. I've already gone over all of those developments in a prior video. So there was an interesting statement made by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff here in the United States, I guess, well, short of the commander in chief, the president is the highest ranking military official, General Mark Milley, who made the suggestion that now that Ukraine had liberated Kherson, Zelensky and the Ukrainian government really needed to get more serious about kickstarting negotiations. And the reason he gave for that wasn't because he loves Putin or he hates Ukraine or whatever, the inflamed passions that this conflict has evoked might indicate. In fact, he's really talking about trying to negotiate a resolution to the conflict before it turns into a World War I style stalemate. A war of attrition is not a war that really the United States and the Europeans want to see, because that kind of a war most likely really does benefit Russia, even though Russia has a host of production issues, supply line issues, supply chain issues, issues with the sanctions and domestic production, economic activity, and so forth. We all know all of the problems in Russia, but it's not like the United States and its Western partners are somehow without any of those same issues. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about some of those military production issues in a minute. But let me get into the meat of all of this. The point being here that this is pushing back against Zelensky. It's pushing back against the sort of idea that Ukraine can only resolve the conflict through a victory on the battlefield, right? This is really one of the key issues here. Do we support Ukraine in fighting off its invaders? Of course. But it's another question to ask, do you want the war to continue until there is a complete and total capitulation by Russia? That's a more complicated question because it necessarily forces us to ask the question, would such a capitulation ever come? Or would Russia instead escalate to a much larger conflict rather than have to admit defeat? That is a very real question. It is one that I pose to all of my Ukrainian friends. Anytime that anybody, raises the question of peace versus, throwing Ukraine under the bus or whatever, it's not only about Ukraine, it's not only about Russia, it is about the unpredictable effects of what might happen in some kind of a total victory or a total defeat or even something approaching that. This is one of the complications of this war, and unfortunately it's one of those complications that makes it difficult to side with anybody, really, if you're genuinely interested in peace. So the pushback was strong and swift. It came from a number of different places who were disagreeing with Mark Milley, basically saying you cannot force Ukraine, you cannot force Zelensky and his government to enter into a negotiation. And in fact, that sort of relies on Biden's, I don't know when he said this, at some point, Biden's statement, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. In other words, the United States is not going to dictate to Ukraine how to resolve the war. Well, guess what? There's a lot of other factors involved that might actually force the Biden administration to do precisely that, or at least lean much more heavily on the Zelensky government. And in fact, it seems from some of the reports that we've read that they are doing so. Of course, Zelensky has his own set of domestic concerns that I think people in the United States, and especially on the left, totally ignore. They ignore completely the fact that the people in Ukraine, something like 75 to 85% of them, do not favor the immediate negotiation scenario, do not favor some kind of territorial compromises or whatever. Now, you may sit in Brussels or in Washington or in Los Angeles or wherever and say, well, sorry Ukrainians, but this is bigger than you. That may be true, but the Ukrainians are the ones that are actually being killed. They're the ones whose families are underneath missiles that are raining down on them. Okay, so it is not exactly the same when a person in Los Angeles or New York, as I am, or elsewhere, is speaking about these things conceptually, and a person in Ukraine is speaking about these things because their mother's home is a pile of rubble. So those are not the same. And people, unfortunately, I feel like I have to say that, even though it really should be self evident. Okay. So the real question here is, does a long war strengthen or weaken the United States? And this is the crux of what I wanted to talk about here. I'm already way over the time that I expected to talk about this opening here, but does a long war benefit the US? For the last 9 months, most of us, myself included, have made the point in many different ways at many different times and in many different contexts that part of the motivation for the United States was to bleed Russia. Now, this is also what the pro-Russian Putin propagandist, liars like to also say, right? That the United States has goaded Russia into this conflict. The United States has threatened Russia over 30 years, pushing NATO to Russia's border, forcing Russia to commit these war crimes, forcing Russia to invade Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying any of that, but I am going to point out that, strategic planners in the United States throughout the entire Cold War, and if obviously, as Zbigniew Brzezinski famously with Afghanistan, wanted that scenario to play out. So it's not out of nowhere that people say this, but it also raises another question. Is the idea of a long war only one sided? In other words, is it only bleeding Russia, or is it possible that it also bleeds the United States and its European allies? This question, that second part of the question, is now beginning to bubble up to the surface, and there's many different reasons why. I'm going to go into those, but this is really what I want you to think about as we go through some of this information. Can we continue to assume that a long war really benefits the United States? Maybe we can. I don't know. Let's talk through some of the facts. So the Biden administration seems conflicted. There's several reasons why. The first is what happens after the liberation of Kherson. Some military planners seem to think that it could potentially signal additional victories coming in the future, and it's all the more reason to continue supporting Ukraine. But others, and I would count myself, not that I'm a military expert, but just based on my, layperson's perspective on it. I would count myself in the second group, which is the group that would say that the liberation of Kherson probably leads to a deadlock. It probably leads to more difficult terrain for the Ukrainians, terrain that's not only physical terrain, but more difficult scenarios for the Ukrainians as the Russians hunker down, invest in their defenses, call up more conscripts, and add to the ever growing forces that they have there. So, this question about whether it would be gains or whether it would be deadlock, I think, is at the center of this. The Ukrainian forces are basically now within HIMARS range. That's those US supplied missiles, those HIMARS range of the Crimea supply lines. This is very good for Ukraine if Ukraine is really adamant about trying to liberate Crimea and reincorporate Crimea into Ukraine, which from my perspective is not really feasible. Um, this also could potentially, the liberation of Kherson puts them in a position to do that. It also puts the Ukrainians in a position to free up troops that they had invested in the offensive in Kherson to go to other offensives elsewhere, perhaps in Donetsk or elsewhere. Okay. On the other hand, now that the Kherson has been liberated, the Ukrainian army needs to rest. They also expect stiffer Russian resistance thanks to new conscripts. As I mentioned, shorter supply lines makes it easier for the Russians to bring their hardware, defensive positions, trenches, and so forth. Right? Again, just as Milley said, a World War I style scenario. The Russians are hunkering down, preparing to essentially outlast Ukraine and the West in this conflict. And I have to say, I did predict that that was exactly what Russia would do more than 6 months ago. I said that it was clear that the Russians failed miserably in their sort of, blitzkrieg strategy, to use the Nazi terminology. They failed to shock and awe their way to Kiev. They failed in most of the initial objectives. And so they shifted quickly into this protracted war footing. And this is really where we are. So that's, I think you could say, one large question for the Biden administration: more gains after Kherson or deadlock? The second question is about Russia and possible escalation, right? So just because Ukraine liberates Kherson, what does that ultimately mean? Does it mean that Ukraine then marches forward and takes more and more and more territory away from Ukraine, or sorry, away from Russia? Or does it mean that Russia, and Russia, by the way, then what? Tucks its tail between its legs, goes home and cries while Putin just accepts the humiliation and pretends it didn't happen? I don't think so. The second issue for the Biden administration is escalation. Obviously, Putin's nuclear saber rattling is at the top of the list there, but it is not the only way that Russia can escalate. They have all kinds of direct and indirect means of retaliation, of escalation, both at the tactical nuclear level, but also, with more traditional hardware, and also, of course, in other parts of the world, as we've seen in countless examples throughout this war. Let's see. To me, I will just say, I simply, I, I cannot possibly imagine a scenario in which Ukraine takes Crimea from Russia. I can't see it. Crimea really is the centerpiece of everything that Putin has done in the last decade or more. It is the centerpiece of the so-called Russian resurrection, with all of the religious overtones there. It is the centerpiece of Russian right-wing nationalist rhetoric and ideology. It was the reunification. Remember, they didn't annex Crimea; they simply reunified it with Russia. So the idea of Crimea as being on the table, I think, is probably not correct. However, Kherson and Zaporizhia are very different. Okay, so would Putin escalate to a nuclear conflict over Kherson or Zaporizhia? I would say probably not. Would he do the same over Crimea? I would say probably. So or at least it would be within the realm of possibility, something not to be ignored. And so then again, we come back to this same issue. Escalation is a very real danger for the United States, and obviously even more so for Europe. Third issue, the pro-Ukraine coalition. Of course, I mean, especially in Europe, this is beginning to fray, as we all knew it would. This many countries don't stay on the same page for long, especially when it comes to strategic issues like this. So Putin's not willing to compromise. We have not seen any evidence, despite what the RT and Sputnik cheerleading idiot section has to say about it. Putin is Zelensky is not the only reason why there was no negotiations after the first couple of months. Putin shows zero willingness to negotiate either. And it's not just Secretary of State Blinken who's saying that. In fact, sources on both sides have indicated that Putin isn't really willing to return to to the negotiating table unless there is something for him there. And what would that be? What could that be? We'll talk about that in another video. Um, let's see. The other issue here with regard to the pro Ukraine coalition is the fact that the Republican Party in the United States is going to take control of the House of Representatives in about a month or so, once the new session begins. What does that mean for the future? What does that mean for the future of supplying Ukraine with arms? Well, again, the Republican Party itself is somewhat fractured. There are some who are definitely, clearly on the side of arming Ukraine, along with the general consensus in the United States among the sort of ruling circles. At the same time, there is the far right Trumpist element, with for all sorts of reasons that I do not have time to go into right now, that is pushing against supplying Ukraine with funds and weapons. So, what does this mean politically? I would say that for now, at least, probably nothing. The United States probably continues supplying all of those things. I don't think the Republicans, or at least the far right Republicans, I don't think that they are strong enough at this point to be able to block that. However, that very easily can change in 2024, as I've mentioned many times before, and certainly the man in the Kremlin understands that. But we will talk about that as well. There's also the issue of uh, the pro Ukraine coalition fraying is what's driving the US to lean on Zelensky to negotiate. Remember, Zelensky said that he would not negotiate over anything related to the war except with the next leader of Russia. In other words, he wouldn't negotiate with Putin. Guess what? Not on the table for Zelensky anymore. The United States has made it very clear that regime change ain't happening in Russia anytime soon. And so negotiation is the order of the day, at least according to some. The fourth issue is the issue of whether or not this war is a real windfall for the United States. In so many ways, it is. Weapons contracts, energy contracts to Europe, so many, obviously, the depletion of the Russian military, everything seems like it's going the US's way. But there are problems with that as well. So let's talk about some of the positives and negatives for the United States. Obviously, the depletion of the Russian military, that's a given. That's a positive for the US, for the various imperialist interests in the West. The second aspect of this is the expansion of NATO and the strengthening of NATO, the unification of NATO, or the reunification of NATO. NATO, as I've said many times before, was at its lowest point before this war began. The humiliation after 20 years in Afghanistan for NATO, the humiliation over and over again of NATO being involved in US wars that are not even within the purview of NATO, not even within the European theater. Okay, so NATO was really suffering. There was no interest in joining NATO from Sweden, from Finland. These countries that have been historically neutral towards NATO, they're now in. Okay, so that's obviously a huge victory for the United States. China itself now facing difficulties in the Pacific region, in the Asia Pacific. Japan, Taiwan, Australia, all beginning to look at China with a greater degree of nervousness. All of them beginning to rearm or to bolster their arsenals. This is, of course, obviously good for the United States. It allows the United States to continue to exercise a certain degree of hegemony in that region while simultaneously allowing its local allies like Australia, Taiwan, Japan to assume some of the more day to day military responsibilities. But it's not all positives for the United States. There are big negatives to this as well. Number one, the distraction from other regions. The United States, for the imperialist juggernaut that it is, the United States does not have unlimited resources either. It doesn't have an unlimited diplomatic corps. It doesn't have unlimited special forces. It doesn't have unlimited financial resources. So you have regions in other parts of the world, say Latin America, for example, where the United States is historically the hegemon, historically overthrowing governments, meddling in elections, destroying indigenous movements, destroying leftist movements, attacking environmentalist groups, etc., defending US corporations, and on and on. How much can the United States accomplish in Latin America if all of its resources are devoted to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, etc.? This is a very real question. There are limited resources even for the imperial giant. And from a material perspective, the consumption of U.S. artillery munitions, this is a very real concern. I'm going to get into a whole issue. I'm going to get into that whole issue here in about 20 seconds. And then from the positive side, quote unquote positive, and I say positive for me and for anyone who's anti-war, these are all negatives. None of this is good. That was my whole point. That was one of the central arguments I made in opposing this war from the very beginning, was that the war was only going to justify more war. It was only going to lead to more arms manufacturing, more missiles being manufactured, more drones, more submarines, more nukes, more everything. So that was clear from the very beginning. And of course, now we have this question. Can the United States continue to supply ammunition to Ukraine? The answer is no, not at the current rate. And so, how is this a positive? Well, of course, the United States is now looking to boost defense industrial production. That means more weapons, more ammunition to be produced in the United States and then exported out elsewhere to Ukraine and elsewhere. Again, death upon death upon death. These are disastrous effects of this disastrous and criminal war. And again, I'm going to get into the scale of this in a second, but this, I put it in these terms because I feel like, and I've been sitting here for a couple of weeks not doing a video, but I've been trying to watch things here and there, but I just feel like almost nobody is recalling what it means to be anti-war at all. Anti-war means anti-war. It means being anti-war, being opposed to all of these things. Okay. And it is not just opposing the United States producing these weapons. It's not just opposing the Europeans from sending them into Ukraine. You also have to oppose Russia because Russia is raining death on millions of people. Let's talk about just how much. Weapon shortage. This is a very real problem now for the United States and for the West. There were many in the West, and this has also been written about in a number of articles. It's not my, original analysis here, but I do think we should go through it, talk through some of these issues. The European and American strategic planners for the last couple of decades really have been operating under the assumption that there really never would be another land war in Europe. A land war, a tank war, whatever you want to call it, a conventional military conflict, the way that we saw in World War II. That thinking led to decreasing reliance on traditional ammunition and therefore decreasing production of traditional ammunition. And that, of course, is now turned on its head as Russia criminally invades Ukraine. And please note, I keep saying that phrase because I want to just remind our friends and our enemies as well that when they cheerlead for this war, they are cheerleading war crime. They are cheerleading war crimes. Okay? So that was the thought at that point. Now, obviously, the artillery use has been staggering. Let's put a little bit of context here. In Afghanistan, remember, 20 years NATO was in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, NATO fired roughly 300 rounds a day. That was the average. They had almost no use for air defenses because there was no real threat of any air attacks, either air defenses, either in the form of aircraft or in the form of any kind of, surface to surface missiles or anything like that, right? That wasn't the sort of thing that NATO had to worry about with the Taliban and Al Qaeda and so forth. Now, so 300 rounds a day in Afghanistan. In Ukraine, they are firing thousands of rounds a day. And still the need for air defense against Russian missiles and against Iranian drones. Now, according to an expert whose name I did not write down, but from one of the think tanks, I think it was from CSIS, the Strategic Institute, whatever the hell they call it. A day in Ukraine is a month or more in Afghanistan. That was the comparison. Okay, so let's put a little bit of specific context to that. Summer of this year, so just a couple of months ago, in Donbass, Ukraine was firing 6,000 to 7,000 rounds of artillery per day. Again, remember, NATO was firing 300 a day in Afghanistan. Ukraine in Donbass was firing 6,000 to 7,000 per day. Want to know how much the Russians were firing? 40 to 50,000 artillery rounds per day. 40 to 50,000 a day. Think about what kind of damage those 40 to 50,000 rounds of artillery were doing every time they blasted into the side of a building, every time they landed on a school or in a playground or in a hospital or whatever. That's war. And that's what the Russians are doing, obliterating whole cities. What we saw in Mariupol is a good example. What do you really think 40 to 50,000 artillery rounds in a day would do in a city? So the US and NATO are scrambling now to find more ammo. It's scarce. They're looking specifically for Soviet era ammo that is compatible with all of the hardware that Ukraine already has. And by the way, which is not compatible with the more advanced hardware that the United States and the West has not provided to Ukraine. So they're looking specifically for like S-300 air defense missiles, which is old technology from the Soviets. T-72 tanks, the same. Soviet caliber artillery shells. This is a big one, right? The NATO shells and the Russian shells are of a different caliber. The Soviet era caliber, those are compatible with a lot of the hardware that's already there and a lot of the hardware that could be purchased, on the black market and elsewhere. So the what are the alternatives? What are the alternatives to shrinking the expensive air defense missiles, the anti-tank javelins? There aren't any, except for these old Soviet weapons. So in other words, the United States really only has two choices. Either get Ukraine these Soviet era weapons or provide Ukraine with the contemporary, up-to-date, technologically advanced NATO standard weapons. They're not going to do that. They are not doing that. That's one of the biggest sources of conflict here. This is also the United States is now, and the Europeans too, are signaling to weapons manufacturers that there are long-term contracts to be had here if they're willing to be the main producers of this. The United States is now backfilling its own ammunition stockpile by purchasing ammunition from South Korea. So they're sending ammunition to Ukraine and then backfilling its supplies with purchases from South Korea. But the problem is that there are a lot of legal restrictions on the export of weapons, legal restrictions on the ability to send weapons to another country that's going to send them into a war. So that's actually the reason why Switzerland and Italy, and I think a couple of other countries, refused German requests on several occasions, because the weapons that had been produced in Switzerland and sold to Germany cannot legally then be exported to Ukraine, since Ukraine is in a war. Right. So there are legal hurdles as well. And again, I mean, while the Russian state can operate essentially without any legal restrictions at all, as it is essentially criminal regime, maybe not even criminal. It's just kind of it's sort of an authoritarian kleptocracy, basically. And they can kind of do what they want. But in Europe, it doesn't quite work like that. There are more stringent rules, there are legal obligations. And a country like Switzerland, which does continue to practice its neutrality as it has for centuries now, Switzerland and other countries, they're not willing to go along. All right, so here's an interesting thing. I didn't know about this until I read this piece. The $3.2 billion or 3.1 billion euros that have been approved by the European Union to repay member states for the supplies to Ukraine. So they created a fund. They called it the European Peace Facility. The European Peace Facility is intended to essentially pay back those countries that have sent material to Ukraine. Problem is, the fund, which was several $billion, is now 90% depleted. So what happens next? You're going to begin to see conflict emerging between the wealthier and less wealthy countries in Europe, in particular countries like Germany and France and the Netherlands. They are going to face very significant pushback from countries, not just Hungary with the fascist Orban, but others. Countries like Italy and Spain and others who may not be so keen to continue on in this way. So you have about 20 out of 30 of the European Union countries that are essentially tapped out. They can provide no more. So that means a greater burden on those remaining larger countries, France, Germany, the Netherlands, etc. You have roughly $40 billion have been provided to Ukraine from European countries. For scale, that is roughly equal to the entire annual defense budget of France. Okay, so the second largest economy and second largest power in Europe has a total annual defense budget equal to what Europe has provided to Ukraine. That's, again, a sense of the scale in all of this. And it's not to say that I'm making a positive or a negative, judgment about that, other than to say that the scale is massive. So, what is Ukraine looking for? They're essentially looking for several things. One is long range surface to surface missiles, the so called ATACMS, ATACMS is the acronym. Those missiles are extremely dangerous because they could hit both Crimea and Russia. So, do you want to see Ukraine striking regularly inside the borders of Russia? I mean, they've done it a couple of times, but mostly to like supply depots, pipelines, and other infrastructure part of the Russian supply lines. But what if the Ukrainians started firing missiles into Russian cities? I mean, we're talking about the potential for a much wider conflict. And that, of course, has its own implications and the potential for what it could do to Russian society, mobilizing mass forces, mass mobilization around a sort of patriotic fervor of national defense, as opposed to what we see now, which is this chaotic and disastrous attempt to conscript people into an increasingly unpopular war. Okay, so long range surface to surface missiles. They also want Western fighter jets. Obviously, they have not been provided that. I think it's very unlikely that they will be at any point. Western tanks, same. I think it's pretty unlikely. And more advanced air defenses. This is possible, but again, it seems like another escalation that the United States is unwilling to do, precisely because it would require US and NATO involvement more directly, especially if it's to train and operate in use of those more advanced systems. All right. I am already over 30 minutes, so I'm going to finish up with just one quick story. There's going to be a lot more. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. I have more that I will be putting up there shortly. But here's a story that I talked about at the very beginning of this war, and it seems like it may soon come to fruition. And that is that the war in Ukraine becoming internationalized. And internationalized meaning internationalized in terms of who's fighting it, who's fighting on the ground. Okay, so we have now reports that there are Syrians, Afghans, North Koreans, and Iranians who may potentially enter into this conflict. I don't know yet how serious this is. It's not clear whether this is really new information or if this is just rehashing what we already knew about. But I do think that we should pay attention to some of the legal changes that are being made in Russia that lay the groundwork for this potentially to happen. So Moscow is making it easier for foreigners to fight in this war. It's doing so in a number of ways. One, it has made changes in the law that now allow dual citizens to be drafted into the military if they are residents of the Russian Federation. So you could be a dual citizen living in some other country. You're probably okay. If you're a dual citizen and you're still in Russia, boy, it's time to pack that bag and get the hell out of there because you very well could be conscripted. Second is expedited path to citizenship for nationals of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, which is the organization of the former Soviet, of the republics of the former Soviet Union. So basically, former Soviet republics. If you're a citizen of those countries and you are fighting for Russia in Ukraine, you get an expedited path to citizenship, and also making it easier for volunteers from foreign countries, like Syria, Afghanistan, North Korea, Iran, potentially, to enter into the conflict as volunteers to fight on the side of Russia. Now, interestingly, the Russian military commanders, by and large, seem to be against this idea precisely because they're afraid that it could actually harm unit cohesion and also create conflicts within their units, as has already happened on several occasions. Now, there's another complication in all of this, though, for Russia, and that is that the two biggest countries, two most powerful countries in the former Soviet space, who provide a tremendous number of foreign workers inside of Russia, being Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, both of those countries have warned their citizens not to engage in any military activity on behalf of Russia, and that if they do so, they themselves could potentially face serious criminal penalties in their home countries. So, bottom line is Russia needs bodies and Russia can't find them. Russia's struggling and it's changing its laws in order to make it easier to call people up into military service and to remove the barriers to those volunteers who want to get in. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us that the long, protracted war is here. The Russians, of course, are struggling, and yet at the same time, they do have the bodies. They do have the bodies to throw at the front line, and that is one of the dangers here. The war plows on here as we enter into the winter period, and unfortunately, there's going to be more killing, there's going to be more death, and there's going to be more destruction. And I would remind everyone that if you're truly anti-war, you're really anti-war, then you should be looking at the reality of this conflict and get your head out of the geopolitical morass that YouTube punditry has become and focus on what's real, what's happening, and how we get the hell out of this situation. That's all I have for today. Going to talk a lot more about the energy crisis in Europe, what it means for Europeans. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some other issues related to Russia, what Russia's doing in Africa and elsewhere. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. That's where you can find all of the work. Go over to Counterpunch. Counterpunch Plus is the subscription to get. Support Counterpunch. It is the best. Thank you so much for the support. Talk to you all next time.